So, this vlog is on racial superiority. So, while race definitely exists and is genetic, and racism is ubiquitous, especially amongst human beings and all animals, racial superiority often does come up. I tried to deny a lot of racial superiority and even tried to counter some of the arguments and even correct. And I failed at a lot of that when I really sat and read the literature broadly. And not just the newest literature that some people think is the most correct, but also the older literature that some people think are flawed. And while there might be some inaccuracies, there's still a lot of value in all that. And for that reason, these older literacists and scientists, anthropologists and writers, their work hasn't been discarded, thrown away, or burned. It still exists, and it's curated and kept so that people can read it and learn from it. So while there are groups like Nina Jablonski, Sarah Tishkoff, Daniel Lieberman, and a whole host of them, and then even some that even came up with this denial of certain racialist ideas, who I just don't know off the top of my head at this point, but I've definitely read some of their work. There are others who people reject, such as Philip Rushton, Richard Lynn, Stoddard, and a whole host of others. Germans, a lot of Germans too. But I know that their stuff is pretty correct on many levels too. They might have taken it to the extreme and even thought that the difference would have been closer to 100% amongst a white person and a black person, or a cracker and a nigger, or whatever. From the white world, the most descriptive terms would be a white Caucasian human being and a nigger. That's definitely how they framed it, and I'm sure that sticks with them. Sorry, but they couldn't find differences to the exact extreme level that they might have envisioned, and for that reason, a lot of people rejected their work. While the truth is that the difference might not be as extreme, genetically and phenotypically, according to what they thought, it's still not the null. And there's more than enough evidence to know that there are race-specific genes. There's one excellent paper from 2008 that even lists some of these. And there's also a website that lists all the color genes that have been described and identified in all animal models, largely and primarily a lot of mice, which is an indication of which are race genes. I mean, it's not even just an indication, that is inherent to race. So there's no way that anybody who really understands the literature in totality can deny race as a concept, as an existing factor, and having a genetic basis due to evolution. It wasn't easy to go through all that information on my own and to take my time and understand it. I didn't do all of it on my own. I learned a lot of this in medical school. But there were always clues that race was important. And I'm not just talking about the social clues, such as a white person usually preferring a white person and a black person usually clinging to a black person or preferring a black person, or vice versa. White person clinging to white, black person clinging to black, brown sticking with brown. I'm referring more so to, the most specific example has to do with a medication called Bidil, which affects people with a certain genotype differently than others, and that genotype is more commonly expressed in Black Americans. So, there's no doubt race is real, race is important, and race has a genetic basis. And it's at least 72 genes in humans, or 72 alleles, or I think in haplogroup it would probably be doubled from what my understanding is, but at the minimum 72 haplogroups. That part of genetics, I'd have to learn more to get to the point where I could really do stuff in a lab, but on genetics. But I do know that part is not wrong, no matter what anyone says. Either they're just a budding scientist that's confused, a layperson who's wishfully thinking, or an old scientist who took a stand and got it wrong. Now, having said that, I do want to focus specifically on racial superiority, and I want to get to my conclusion and how I got to it. And I do understand and appreciate more why people who do focus on race usually quickly get to these issues of racial superiority, supremacy, and start to pick sides and defend their point. I didn't want to pick a side. I wanted to try to do as objectively as possible. While I tried to overcome my bias for a long time, my racial bias specifically, in doing that, I eventually got to my conclusions and realized I did it as objectively as I could, but there obviously still are inherent quote-unquote flaws that will be perceived, which will be perceived as my bias, which, I just can't deny that, because that would be stupid when I know that exists. And I know that just the fact that I have a brain and I perceive the world through my senses, and that's encoded in my body, I'm going to have unconscious bias, subconscious bias, and conscious bias. And it's really just my conscious bias and maybe a little bit of my subconscious bias that I can really overcome, and my unconscious bias still exists. So, having said that, let me get to my conclusions about racial superiority, and I'll even touch a little bit on how I was thinking about it before and how I think about it now. So before, especially growing up in the American educational system where we're taught that all men are created equal, I really tried to subscribe to that. A white person and a black person are equal. They just have different skin. But the problem that I had with that is if they're equal, then why do they have a different skin color? They're no longer equal. You can even write an equation for that, and you won't get an equal sign. At best, you might get an approximation or some approximation of equal in ability and phenotype and even genotype, but it won't be the same. And that's undeniably true. Anybody who argues that point is just stupid and wrong, confused or deluded. So starting from that basis and also seeing the difference in these populations as I lived in Canada, which is very white, no matter what any Canadian thinks, that's a very white country. One of the whitest. And also living in Jamaica, which is very black, 90%, 70 to 90% black skinned maroons and Congoids, or ex-Congoids. Became even more apparent. There are differences. When I hear what the blacks talk about and their struggles, it's quite different to what I hear when I'm with the whites. And as I tried to understand that difference and even magnify it, I got to the point of understanding Thomas Fitzpatrick and his scale, and then really refining my definition of white Caucasian to just Fitzpatrick 1 people and black niggers or Congoids to just Fitzpatrick 6 people. And when I did that, the difference obviously became even larger in behavior, cognitive ability, thinking, intelligence, phenotypic differences, nose structure, cartilaginous differences, even civilization building. And I started to understand white supremacy a lot better, why they feel they're supreme, and why in some ways, and most ways, I would say a lot of ways at least, they are superior. So I've kind of getting to the conclusion already that yes, I would say the white race is the superior race of human beings, of Homo sapien, and probably, and in some ways even justifiably, consider themselves to be a different animal. Are they a different species? that hasn't bared out, but they definitely are a different race, which is just a subspecies classification. So we all are still considered human. We are one human species made up of at least 3 different races in the broadest categorization, being white, brown, and black. So, just to give a little bit more on my former thinking, what I would try to say is, yes, we have different abilities. Blacks are good at certain things that whites might not be good at. Whites are good at other things that blacks are not good at. But that started to fall apart when I put it into a historical perspective. I'll give you a very specific example that I've written about, which is sprinting. The black race, even Jamaica specifically, and obviously black Americans. Black Americans and black Jamaicans are known for their sprinting ability. They run very fast and have even refined their technique. Michael Johnson being an example, Usain Bolt being another example, Ben Johnson being another example, and there are others. And then on the women's side, there are others too. But when I started thinking about the development of the Olympics and the development of sprinting as a sport, it wasn't the blacks who came up with sprinting, and they didn't even come up with the word sprinting. So how is it that we can really give them credit for being the best sprinters? When it comes to their ability to actually sprint, yes, I understand. They've set those records. I'm not discounting that. But I'm just trying to kind of, in a sense, reverse extrapolate some of these ideas and some of the totality of my thoughts to explain that while it's great to be able to do something once it's been defined for us as black people or brown people or even white people, it's a different level when that person creates it, comes up with it, invents it, and makes it happen. And when it comes to the Olympics, we give credit to the Greeks. I'm pretty sure it's somewhere between the Irish, the British, the Germans, the Romans, and the Greeks that assisted with that, as those civilizations were far enough north and already cooperating and working together at that point in history, which I don't know if that was the hundreds of BCE or before Common Era or during the Common Era, but 2,000 years ago or so. Someone can even comment on that if they want to clarify the origination of the Olympics and how that happened. But it was definitely white people, and in the broadest definition of white being Fitzpatrick 1 to 3, they were definitely in that classification of skin color. They weren't really, they might have been 4s, which would introduce a little more bit of the Negroids, but that still ends up being the whiter community, even of the blacks. So if we do the broadest definition of black people, it would be Fitzpatrick 4 to Fitzpatrick 6. But to become a 4, you typically have to have some kind of white genes in you. It's not just from nutrition and diet while living in the Congo. It's from migrating far enough north to inbreed with people who are whiter than you. That's how you become a 4. There's no doubt about that. I've observed enough people to know that. It is possible there are some outliers, but every population I've looked at that is about my skin color or a little bit lighter, like a Fitzpatrick 3 was straighter hair, or I'm a little bit darker with straighter hair, all got out of Africa. And they all got into Asia or Eastern Europe at the least, and some of them settled in India, in present-day India. So they got far enough north, and then there was also some mixing, some racial admixture amongst the humans, as well as hominin admixture. Sorry. So now that led me to realize that when you do it in totality, yes, the whites still end up being superior, and there's just no doubt about that. And I can even understand why they might have slowed down in sprinting for a few different reasons. One, as they became more cognitive, running fast did not make the difference. And I know this benefited them in war. And instead of sprinting to get out of problems, they would think their way in and out of problems, which is a tribute to their cognitive ability. And I'm pretty sure that is one of the factors and one of the bases for why whites are more intelligent than the other races, and even why Asians are more intelligent than some of the other races too. Conflating a little bit, yes, I think a lot of it has to do with creativity as well. So there are other indicators of intelligence that are not necessarily purely intelligent. And when I take that in consideration, it still points me back to the white Caucasians being the most intelligent. And for me, I'm pretty sure that ends up being Ireland, Britain, Australia, and then Germany. And then in the New World, eventually Canada and the white Americans of the United States. Those being the most intelligent of the whites. The other things, the evidence that led me to finally conclude that white Caucasians are superior as a race of humans is that they're the ones who really developed the civilizations. While we point to Egypt often to say that Egypt was one of the first civilizations, and when I first realized that, I largely thought of them as brown people. I wasn't sure if they were brown or black, but as they're meeting Egyptians, including Omar Medhat, and looking at his skin color and comparing it to mine, while it was close in some shades, there were some differences. And when I'm not tanning, while mine sometimes looked a little more fair, there was a little difference in the color, although he tanned a lot. So had he not tanned, he might have been even fairer than I. But he definitely had the longer straight hair. That keeps him up in Fitzpatrick 3. But as I started putting in the context of history and this mass migration of a population of humans out of the Congo and out, via that Arabian Peninsula, that leads them through Egypt. And if you take into consideration global warming and climate change, and that the Earth was probably cooler at that period of time, I don't know how many years, maybe 5, 10,000, 20,000 years ago, that population would have actually been ancestors or predecessors to the more current day white Caucasians on some level. Maybe it was 40,000 years ago. And so those whites, I'm pretty sure, who were settled amongst the Egyptians played a role. I can't really say that definitively because I don't have all the definitive evidence of that. So that's really still more of a theory. But I'm pretty sure there was a lot of white Caucasian influence. And, at that point, some of the predecessors to white Caucasians might have been brown, a shade of brown. There is already evidence of that in that a brown man who has a specific name that they use. I think it's Cheddar Man, who they describe as one of the people who got to Britain, or what one of the people who got to Britain would have looked like. And, they gave him brown skin. He still wasn't exactly black. He's not a Fitzpatrick 6 Congoid. So that's not black anymore. But I do understand that if we all came out of one population, yes, the most likely thing is that population would have been dark brown or black. Fitzpatrick 5 or Fitzpatrick 6, which does, include blacks and clearly shows that they're not necessarily non-human. But having said that, all this still keeps pointing to white Caucasians being the superior race on Earth. No doubt about that. So civilizations, that's a big thing. We point to Egypt, but it was probably a whiter population than what it is now. And there definitely weren't black Congoid 6 people running around Egypt building pyramids. It was brown people who did it themselves at the least. and probably why they were able to build some massive structures that still exist today. When you get to the more refined civilizations, yes, while Egypt is great, it's still not the most refined civilization. It's really Ireland and Britain and probably Germany, and are probably, three of the most refined, and I would say Australia, and then maybe Canada, and eventually even the United States. Those are the ones that I would put up there. There's evidence that they started really using their intelligence and creativity, but primarily intelligence at that point. And I know Stonehenge is a big example of that. There are some other examples, but those don't predate Stonehenge, which for me puts the whites even farther ahead. And then when you get to more modern day inventions that we all use for the most part, and we all appreciate for the most part, things such as plumbing, toilets, massive buildings, electricity, locomotion, specifically cars, bicycles, trains, planes. All of these were invented by white Caucasians. And without a doubt, definitely people who were between Fitzpatrick 1 and 3 for the most part. And even in Jamaica, it's not like the black Congoids or the Maroons went and built the buildings on Jamaica. It was the Spanish who were about Fitzpatrick 2 or 3. And they're usually about Fitzpatrick 2, specifically referring to Hispanics. And the British, and Irish even, and the Germans. Those were the ones that really built the buildings on the island of Jamaica and assisted us or gave us the tools and pretty much assisted us really with, pretty much built it for us. I mean, that's really the truth. The electricity and the buildings and, the plumbing and stuff. So, some people might be confused. Why is it that a nigger can be a good plumber? Well, it's not because he went and invented the whole rotted thing, but it's because he's not incapable of doing certain things. And, he is on some level also a human form, but it really points to his cognitive ability to follow directions at the least, to read and write, and to understand and apply that knowledge in some format. So he might not have come up with it on his own, which is usually the case. He didn't create it. He didn't invent it. But with the proper tools and proper instruction and teaching and education, which is part of the reason why we have all these education systems all over Earth, he can learn and he can do those things. But I do know when I compare the ability of a black nigger, a Congoid 6, and a white Caucasian, even a cracker, Fitzpatrick 1, that white person almost always gets it much easierly and much quicker than that black person. And that has not changed in my life. And I've even tried to be very clear about not leading one person or another person in any direction and giving them the exact same instruction as possible as I could. And so kind of standardizing my interactions with people from different races. And that still bears out. So I do have to touch on another point, which is Asians being considered the most intelligent as compared to white Caucasians. Yes, Richard Lynn has written a lot on this, and has shown that Asians tend to have, this is Northeast Asians, tend to have, so the Chinese really, they tend to have an intelligence test of 106 on average, whereas the white Caucasians tend to have an intelligence test of 103. For me, I think that points more to test-taking ability, and not really necessarily test-taking ability, to be quite honest. I really think it just points to their willingness to sit and excel on standardized examinations. I think that's the reason, rather than them being more intelligent than whites. They're pretty good at calculations and quick calculations. I'm part Asian, and I think there probably is a genetic component to me being pretty decent at mathematics and calculus, algebra, geometry, trigonometry. I can understand that stuff better for some reason. And I think it has also to do with the abacus. The Asians definitely invented a few key things, but they didn't invent as much as the white Caucasians when you just limit it to white Caucasians versus Asians. And the Asians also fall in the brown group, usually being Fitzpatrick 3. So, with that, yes, the calculations do come easier for me. For instance, I could sit and calculate certain things and get to some conclusions, some being wrong, some being right, but it's usually helpful. Whereas when it came to my English abilities, I really had to slow down a lot, and I really had to take my time and read slowly, to find things and understand what exactly sorry, I'm still getting over a cold, but I had to understand what exactly those words meant, because my heritage didn't include a lot of those words. And I didn't really know exactly what all those words meant. So I had to rely on Google and dictionaries, Oxford and Webster, and then eventually conversations with a lot of white Caucasian men and women, as well as people from other races. I'm not discounting the value of other races, but I am making it clear that when it comes to superiority and how that's defined, and I know that's not changing, that it's still white Caucasians, and that I'm pretty sure will happen until either all the white Caucasians die out, when another race would probably replace them, and based on the intelligence indicators, that would probably be the Asian race or like a Hispanic race. Or, the white Caucasians will live and be the most intelligent race until the end of the earth, or until they're able to figure out how to live on other planets or find a planet that's compatible with their life. The only thing, I guess this is kind of a caution for white Caucasians on some level, the only thing that I was concerned about as I was reading all this stuff and understanding how delicate and thoughtful they are in their approach to almost everything, I started to realize, that intelligence could be a double-edged sword. If you're over-intelligent and overthink things, simple problems can be very difficult. And if you lose at the simple problems, that could lead to extinction. But I do think they have a lot of checks and balances for that too, as I understood more their social, economic, genetic, phenotypic models, and computer models, computer programmings, They've dichotomized a lot of things, especially for the computer and computer programs, and definitely thought through, every little detail that they could ever think of and incorporated it, and even computers already. So, and yes, it's not just the whites, I understand that, but I'm pretty sure they lead the way. I'm pretty sure with that, Asians do make a large difference, because when it comes to calculations, they're really good. And yes, there are other races, but it's definitely those two that typically lead the way. And then yes, I do think the Hispanics are capable of leading, but I don't think it's as quantitative as the white Caucasians and Asians, and I don't think, it's as, as a result of that, some of the quality probably decreases. And I think that's quite apparent when you even compare white Caucasian companies versus Hispanic companies. For instance, Germany. Germans are pretty much white Caucasians. They're between Fitzpatrick 1 and Fitzpatrick 2. They have a big influence. They do inbreed with Irish people and British people and other white Caucasians. And if you compare the car companies of Germany, like Porsche and Benz, to the car companies of Spain, Spain doesn't really win on that, especially when it comes to technology and performance. When it comes to economical stuff, They have some helpful ideas, but Britain has already figured out most of that too. So, and when if you want to compare a British company like Aston Martin and BMW, British motor vehicles or motor wheels, those are some of the best car companies in the world. And then the Americans already, which are largely the white Caucasian Americans, they have figured out a lot of thriftiness when it comes to cars too, such as Ford, Chevy, And I'm not discounting the Asians. They figure it out too, but I don't think they create it on their own. I think most of the time they follow instruction, just like the blacks, but they do a lot of calculations, and they figure out where all these little gaps and loopholes are, and somehow economize things really well. And their car companies are a good example of that, and one of the reasons why those cars sell so well, which are like Honda, Toyota, Hyundai, and Nissan. So even if you look at car companies, you can start to see the difference in race by quantitatively analyzing that stuff and comparing specific factors. It's like an economical analysis, it's an epidemiological analysis, and it's a technical analysis of productivity, performance, and benefit on multiple levels. That could really be done, and I'm pretty sure stuff like that has already been done and is in the business literature. So I've touched on civilizations, the differences. I've touched on intelligence and differences. I've touched on inventions and technology and some of the differences. One other point about technology and inventions, Bill Gates is an example, coming up with Microsoft. He's a white Caucasian. He's definitely Fitzpatrick, at least Fitzpatrick 2. I'd really have to look at his iris color and really get a better look at his hair color. But from what I've seen of him and what I can recall, he's at least a 2. He's definitely not a 3. And he might be like a 1C. I know he's not the whitest man in the world. I've definitely seen people right here in Boston who are almost always of Irish descent, who are definitely the whitest people on planet Earth. There's no doubt about that. And just to make the counterpoint, it's not an opposite point or an argument. It's just on the other side, which is when it comes to black people, the blackest are definitely the Congoids, probably, specifically from present-day Republic of Congo area. It doesn't get much blacker than that. You can find these things via Google, even if you want to Google it yourselves. You can find it in my books if you just want to passively read it and enjoy it. And you might be able to find it in some other books. So that gets back to that. And the other big point, and this, really is where the Asians, just don't end up holding their ground compared to the white Caucasians and even the Hispanic and Latin communities. When you consider that the British, and I'm pretty sure that included some Irish people. I'm pretty sure what happens in Britain is some Irish people do go to Britain. They add to their gene pool. They add to their intelligence factors, and they make a difference. So, and then also the Arabic people played a big role in this when it comes to slavery, not just slavery, but more importantly, colonization of the earth. Building colonies, building discrete countries, cities, towns, organizing humanity. Again, it's the white Caucasians who did that and took it to the maximal level. Even enslaving other whites first. The Arabics definitely did some of that. Some Irish might have even been enslaved at some point, but also eventually extrapolating those concepts to enslave humans of other races. There's not as much history of Asians being enslaved, but I do know that might have happened on some level. And then definitely blacks, the Congoids, who have and are described as niggers. So, as a result of that, it's the whites who typically make most of the laws and lead the precedents on that. It's the whites who, are mostly the scientists and lead the precedence on that. It's the whites who are mostly the leaders and politicians and presidents and prime ministers and lead the way on that too. And even in black countries, the blackest countries, yes, usually have the blackest leaders. But in Jamaica, which is not the blackest country, but it's definitely of the black countries, it's still led by the whitest portion of that population, which I'm not against, but is a little baffling. Was a little baffling till I started to understand the cognitive differences among the races of humans. Philip Rushton made this point, and I agreed with that. I didn't hear that point until after I had done a lot of my own, qualitative and quantitative analyses, although I didn't use very rigorous, computer models, but I did write notes, I did jot things down, I did start analyzing some things quantitatively with specific numbers that I could find. So it was more of like a secondary, tertiary, or quaternary analysis of other work. It wasn't all primarily done for me in that manner. I had to go out and extract data and extrapolate. So yeah, there are some limitations to that type of analysis, but I took that into consideration in my thinking, and definitely looked at things or thought about things from different angles or viewpoints and perspectives, listened, read other people's work, interacted with people online, putting these points out, and the counter arguments kept failing. Philip Rushton had a similar experience, and I'm pretty sure so did Richard Lynn. So yeah, that's why I'm making these videos at this point and putting this out so boldly and clearly and as objectively as possible, so that at least other people might understand, and at the least I might be able to find the people who do understand this and are interested in engaging in with this as a platform on some level, or at least understanding it and moving forward together. So just to summarize, the evidence definitely, and it's not just because of the evidence. It's not like there's evidence that's discrete from the human in this situation, but pretty much the whites, Caucasian race, are the superior race. And I'm pretty sure there's some type of dosed response between race and intelligence. So the whiter you are, the more intelligent a person tends to be and probably should be on some level. And the blacker you are, the less intelligent. It doesn't mean that the blacks are stupid idiots, but it is a cognitive difference and should be appreciated and incorporated in our thinking and understanding, and does improve interaction. It's not an easy thing to approach or to understand initially, because it can be very divisive and people do get angry. But as you take that approach, eventually you can figure out what really does work, and you can figure out how to do it successfully in your own life. And then there will be tremendous gains. I know corporations take this into consideration. I know the most powerful academic universities, such as Oxford, Harvard, University of Toronto, Yale, probably even the University of West Indies, they definitely take this into consideration. Probably even Pontificia Universidad de Católica in Chile, in Santiago. And I'm pretty sure even the Catholic Church takes this into consideration. And for that reason, the expectations probably should not be the same amongst the different races of humans. The expectations should probably include some bias of race if we want that type of society. That's one way to go about it. Another way is war and genocide. That's another way. Another way is just acceptance. Who cares about the expectations? And to be quite honest, I like all those approaches, but the approach that works for me and the one that I really enjoy, and I've enjoyed even since the age of 3, almost from birth even, is the sexual approach, which is to appreciate everybody for who they are and engage in sexual interactions with them as much as possible. And I've learned a lot about the bodies of humans from different races as a result of that, as well as their brains, their minds, their thinking, their behaviors, and I've seen the differences for myself. And in that sexual approach, I've had close to 100 partners. I'm up to 95 now. And I know that has definitely provided me with a lot of insight into the races of humans, because I've seen the bodies of women from all races on Earth, not joking. And also I've seen the bodies of men from all races of humans on Earth, especially when it's defined in the broadest category as white, brown, and black. But also I've seen them from different specific ethnicities. And I've written about this and even listed them and listed their racial and ethnic origins as much as I knew. I wasn't planning to do all that as I was having sex with all these people, but I got to a point in my life where I wasn't having as much sex as I wanted, and I still wanted to engage in sexual thinking and sexual behaviors, so I decided to write it out and create a list. And I started defining everything that I knew without any doubt, and then took the time to come back to the things that I wasn't sure of and wrote some of that up as well. So just to summarize, white Caucasians, the superior race of humans. Asians have high intelligence according to intelligence quotient tests, in part because of their ability to calculate. I definitely still think, and I'm pretty sure that it is true, that the white Caucasians are still the most intelligent race, because they even take some of those tests with a very whimsical attitude, and they even learn how to fail the test on purpose. Like, they know the information and then they go and fail it on purpose. I've heard stories. There's movies that have been made about this. I know it's not all completely fictional. And I've heard of even classmates who have done this kind of thing, where they actually do know some of the information, but they just want to prove that they can fail too for some reason. But yes, there are whites who, have cognitive deficiencies, mental retardation, so I'm not discounting that either. And then it's probably it's Hispanics in terms of intelligence, after the Asians, the Latin people, other Fitzpatrick 2s, probably the multiracial and biracial people, and then it's the black-skinned people. And while, yes, this system probably seems unfair against the black-skinned people, that still won't explain their inability to come up with intelligence tests on their own as the originator of those tests, not just copying and coming up with something similar, but rather originating something before anybody else. In the case of intelligence tests, I think it was Binet who kind of gets a lot of credit for that, and France. There might have been others, but that's the specific evidence that makes the difference, as opposed to oral tradition or oral stories. I'm not discounting that stuff, but I've been through it enough to know that, we can sit around and keep bullshitting, talking about what we know from the tops of our heads and using the best words possible so that we don't overstep our boundaries, or we can get to business and figure out how to move forward and progress and do it in a way that's positive for everybody on Earth, including ourselves. And I prefer the latter approach, because while it's great to sip coffee, tea, maybe even have a glass of wine or, orange juice or lemonade, talking about the same old shit just ain't making the difference. So it's time to move forward. All right, so there it is. That's my conclusion on that. That's racial superiority. And I guess the last thing that I should say is just that, yes, while race is independent of racial superiority on some level, there clearly is some level of conflation that usually occurs after understanding it long enough. So I understand why, scientists try to shy away from using race and prefer to call it ethnicity. But even with ethnicity, the same thing or a similar thing will happen where it'll become an ethnicitism, and then we'll be thinking as ethnic superiorists. And I'm pretty sure that's already happened. So who gives a shit? Might as well just call it race and move on with our lives. All right, and know that it's pretty much a synonym for ethnicity. Okay, well anyway, I summarized all that. I made some extra points at the end. I've said it as clearly, kind of a little bit off the cuff with what I know, and I'm definitely willing to assist in making more full presentations on these types of things, but I wanted to put my ideas out there as clearly and concisely as I could without really over-organizing every little thing and just quoting all the literature over and over again. Because while it's great to quote everybody else's ideas, I want to use my ideas. I don't want to rely on everybody else's ideas all of the time, because I know I have something to add, I have something to do, and I know that I can accomplish even as a brown-skinned man or a non-white. So there it is. That should round out racial superiority for all of you. And definitely view, subscribe, share, comment. Ciao. Kachai.